Hello, this is Morel Benard with Lady Chatterley's Lover. Yes, Lady Chatterley's Lover, the continuation of the story. Last words were he reached and rang the bell for Mrs. Bolton, but he was yellow at the gills. She went up to her room, furious, saying to herself, him and buying people. Well, he doesn't buy me, and therefore there's no need for me to stay with him. Dead fish of a gentleman with his celluloid soul, and how they take one in, with their manners and their mock wistfulness and gentleness. They've got about as much feeling as celluloid has. She made her plans for the night and determined to get Clifford off her mind. She didn't want to hate him. She didn't want to be mixed up very intimately with him in any sort of feeling. She wanted him not to know anything at all about herself, and especially not to know anything about her feeling for the keeper. This squabble of her attitude to the servants was an old one. He found her too familiar. She found him stupidly insentient, tough, and Indian rubbery where other people were concerned. She went downstairs calmly, with her old demure bearing at dinner time. He was still yellow at the gills, in for one of his liver bouts, when he was really very queer. He was reading a French book. "Have you ever read Proust?" he asked her. "I've tried, but he bores me." "He's really very extraordinary." "Possibly, but he bores me, all that sophistication. He doesn't have feelings. He only has the streams of words about feelings. I'm tired of self-important mentalities." "Would you prefer self-important animalities?" "Perhaps. But one might possibly get something that wasn't self-important." "Well, I like Proust, subtly, and his well-bred anarchy." "It makes you very dead, really." "There speaks my evangelical little wife." They were at it again. But she couldn't help fighting him. He seemed to sit there like a skeleton, sending out a skeleton's cold, grizzly will against her. Almost she could feel the skeleton clutching her and pressing her to its cage of ribs. He too was really up in arms, and she was a little afraid of him. She went upstairs as soon as possible and went to bed quite early. But at 9:30 she got up and went outside to listen. There was no sound. She slipped on a dressing gown and went downstairs. Clifford and Mrs. Bolton were playing cards, gambling. They would probably go on until midnight. Connie returned to her room, threw her pyjamas on the tossed bed, put on a thin tennis dress, and over that a woolen day dress, put on rubber tennis shoes and then a light coat. And she was ready. If she met anybody, she was just going out for a few minutes. And in the morning, when she came in again, she would just have been for a little walk in the dew, as she fairly often did before breakfast. For the rest, the only danger was that someone should go into her room during the night, and that was most unlikely. Not one chance in 100. Betts had not locked up. He fastened up the house at 10 o'clock and unfastened it again at 7 in the morning. She slipped out silently and unseen. There was a half moon shining, enough to make a little light in the world, not enough to show her up in her dark grey coat. She walked quickly across the park, not really in the thrill of the assignation, but with a certain anger and rebellion burning in her heart. It was not the right sort of heart to take to a love meeting. When she got near the park gate, she heard the click of the latch. He was there. Then, in the darkness of the wood, and had seen her. "You are good and early," he said out of the dark. "Was everything all right?" "Perfectly easy." He shut the gate quietly after her and made a spot of light on the dark ground, showing the pallid flowers still standing there open in the night. They went on apart in silence. "Are you sure you didn't hurt yourself this morning with the chair?" she asked. No. "When you had that pneumonia, what did it do to you?" "Oh, nothing. It left my heart not so strong and the lungs not so elastic. But it always does that. And you ought not to make violent physical efforts. Not often." She plodded on in an angry silence. "Did you hate Clifford?" she said at last. "Hate him? No. I've met too many like him to have set myself hating him. I know beforehand I don't care for his sort, and I let it go at that." "What is his sort?" "Nay, you know better than I do. A sort of youngish gentleman, a bit like a lady, and no balls." "What balls?" "Balls. A man's balls." She pondered this. "But is it a question of that?" she said, a little annoyed. "You say a man's got no brain when he's a fool, and no heart when he's mean, and no stomach when he's a funker, and when he's got none of that spunky wild bit of a man in him, you say he's got no balls. When he's a sort of tame." She pondered this. "And is Clifford tame?" she asked. "Tame, and nasty with it. Like most such fellas when you come up against them." "And do you think you're not tame?" "Maybe not quite." At length, she saw in the distance a yellow light. She stood still. "There is a light," she said. "I always leave a light in the house," he said. She went on again at his side, but not touching him, wondering why she was going with him at all. He unlocked, and they went in, he bolting the door behind them, as if it were a prison, she thought. The kettle was singing by the red fire. There were cups on the table. She sat in the wooden armchair by the fire. It was warm after the chill outside. "I'll take off my shoes, they are wet," she said. She sat with her stockinged feet on the bright steel fender. He went to the pantry, bringing food, bread and butter and pressed tongue. She was warm. She took off her coat. He hung it on the door. "Shall you have cocoa or tea or coffee to drink?" he asked. "I don't think I want anything," she said, looking at the table. "But you eat." "Nay, I don't care about it. I'll just feed the dog." He tramped with a quiet inevitability over the brick floor, putting food for the dog in a brown bowl. The spaniel looked up at him anxiously. "Hey, this is thy supper." "Then let her look at that would get it," he said. He set the bowl on the stair-foot mat and sat himself on a chair by the wall to take off his leggings and boots. The dog, instead of eating, came to him again and sat, looking up at him troubled. He slowly unbuckled his leggings. The dog edged a little nearer. What's amiss with thee then? Art upset because there's somebody else here? That's a female, that art. Go, go, go and eat thy supper. He put his hand on her head, and the bitch leaned her head sideways against him. He slowly, softly pulled the long, silky ear. There, he said, there, go and eat thy supper, go. He tilted his chair toward the pot on the mat, and the dog meekly went and fell to eating. Do you like dogs? Connie asked him. No, not really. They're too tame and clinging. He had taken off his leggings and was unlacing his heavy boots. Connie had turned from the fire. How bare the little room was. Yet over his head on the wall hung a hideous enlarged photograph of a young married couple. Apparently him and a bold-faced young woman, no doubt his wife. Is that you? Connie asked him. He twisted and looked at the enlargement above his head. Aye, taken just afore we was married. When I was 21. He looked at it impassively. Do you like it? Connie asked him. Like it? No, I never liked the thing, but she fixed it all up to have it done like. He returned to pulling off his boots. If you don't like it, why do you keep it hanging there? Perhaps your wife would like to have it, she said. He looked up at her with a sudden grin. She carted off everything as was worth taking from the house, he said. But she left that. Then why do you keep it? For sentimental reasons? Nay, I never look at it. I hardly knowed it were there. It's been there since we come to this place. Why don't you burn it? She said. He twisted round again and looked at the enlarged photograph. It was framed in a brown and gilt frame, hideous. It showed a clean-shaven, alert, very young-looking man in a rather high collar and a somewhat plump, bold young woman with hair fluffed out and crimped and wearing a dark satin blouse. It wouldn't be a bad idea, would it? He said. He had pulled off his boots and put on a pair of slippers. He stood up on the chair and lifted down the photograph. It left a big, pale place on the greenish wallpaper. No use dusting it now, he said, setting the thing against the wall. He went to the scullery and returned with hammer and pincers. Sitting where he had sat before, he started to tear off the back paper from the big frame and to pull out the sprigs that held the blackboard in position, working with the immediate quiet absorption that was characteristic of him. He soon had the nails out. Then he pulled out the backboards, then the enlargement itself in its solid white mount. He looked at the photograph with amusement. Shows me for what I was, a young curate, and her for what she was, a bully, he said. The prig and the bully. Let me look, said Connie. He did look indeed very clean-shaven and very clean altogether, one of the clean young men of 20 years ago. But even in the photograph his eyes were alert and dauntless, and the woman was not altogether a bully, though her jowl was heavy. There was a touch of appeal in her. One never should keep these things, said Connie, that one shouldn't. One should never have them made. He brought the cardboard photograph and mount over his knee, and when it was small enough, put it on the fire. It'll spoil the fire, though, he said. The glass and the backboard he carefully took upstairs. The frame he knocked asunder with a few blows of the hammer, making the stucco fly. Then he took the pieces into the scullery. "We'll burn that tomorrow," he said. "There's too much plaster moulding on it." Having cleared away, he sat down. "Did you love your wife?" she asked him. "Love," he said. "Did you love Sir Clifford?" But she was not going to be put off. "But you cared for her," she insisted. "Cared?" he grinned. "Perhaps you care for her now," she said. "Me?" His eyes widened. No, I can't think of her," he said quietly. "Why?" But he shook his head. "Then why don't you get a divorce?" "She'll come back to you one day," said Connie. He looked up at her sharply. "She wouldn't come within a mile of me. She hates me a lot worse than I hate her." "You'll see. She'll come back to you." "That she never will. That's done. It would make me sick to see her." "You will see her. And you're not even legally separated, are you?" "No." "Ah, well, then she'll come back, and you'll have to take her in." He gazed at Connie fixedly. Then he gave a queer toss of his head. "You might be right. I was a fool ever to come back here. But I felt stranded and had to go somewhere. A man's a poor bit of a wastrel blown about. But you're right. I'll get a divorce and get clear. I hate those things like death, officials and courts and judges, but I've got to get through with it. I'll get a divorce." And she saw his jaw set inwardly. She exulted. "I think I will have a cup of tea now," she said. He rose to make it, but his face was set. As they sat at table, she asked him, "Why did you marry her?" "She was commoner than yourself. Mrs. Bolton told me about her. She could never understand why you married her." He looked at her fixedly. "I'll tell you," he said. "The first girl I began with when I was 16. She was a schoolmaster's daughter over at Ollington. Pretty, beautiful, really. I was supposed to be a clever sort of young fellow from Sheffield Grammar School, with a bit of French and German, very much up aloft. She was the romantic sort that hated commonness. She edged me on to do poetry and reading. In a way, she made a man of me. I read, and I thought like a house on fire for her. And I was a clerk in Butterley offices, thin, white-faced fellow, fuming with all the things I read, and about everything I talked to her, but everything. We talked ourselves into Persepolis and Timbuktu. We were the most literally cultured couple in 10 counties. I held forth with rapture to her, positively with rapture. I simply went up in smoke, and she adored me. The serpent in the grass was sex. She somehow didn't have any, at least not where it's supposed to be. I got thinner and crazier. Then I said we'd got to be lovers. I talked her into it as usual. So she let me. I was excited, and she never wanted it. She just didn't want it. She adored me. She loved me to talk to her and kiss her. In that way, she had a passion for me, but the other she just didn't want. And there are lots of women like her. And it was just the other that I did want. So there, we split. I was cruel and left her. Then I took on with another girl, a teacher, who had made a scandal by carrying on with a married man, and driving him nearly out of his mind. She was a soft, white-skinned sort of woman, older than me, and she played the fiddle. And she was a demon. She loved everything about love, except the sex. Clinging, caressing, creeping into you in every way, but if you forced her to the sex itself, she just ground her teeth and sent out hate. I forced her to it, and she could simply numb me with hate because of it. So I was balked again. I loathed all that. I wanted a woman who wanted me and wanted it. Oh, let me stop there. Join me in the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Join me in the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover with me, Morel. See what happened there. See you in the next video.